Hello and welcome to the Electrification Academy. The Academy is a series of webinars on how to enable electrification. My name is Marion Santini and I work for the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP. RAP is a global independent NGO and our mission is to advance policy innovation and thought leadership in the energy community. Today, we'll be talking about electricity grid costs and how to keep them under control. So we know that electricity prices are very important when it comes to assessing whether electrification makes financial sense. At the end of last year, we hosted a webinar on taxes and levies, which make up an important part of our electricity bills. And today we want to focus on grid related costs, how they show up in energy bills, and how we can manage them during the energy transition. And for that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by my colleague Zsuzsa Pato. Zsuzsa leads our European power team, and she works on market design and grid-related issues. And that includes planning, operation, and governance. And Zsuzsa, to introduce us into the topic, I've wanted to ask you, so we know that network tariffs are around 1/3 of an average electricity bill, or at least that's the case in Europe, if I understand well. And grid costs are clearly on the rise. So before we move into the presentations of our speakers today, I wanted to check from your perspective, what are the key ways we can address this grid costs?
Thanks very much, Marianne, and welcome everyone in this webinar. Well, we talk a lot about high electricity prices, and we cannot avoid a discussion on one of the very key elements of the electricity price, which is the network tariff driven by the network costs. So I provided a small, one slide which can frame the whole discussion, and we will have two presentations afterwards, one a more generic one and more special one, to go into some of the features in this single slide, which I want to share with you today. Can you see this? Can you see it?
I can see it. You can put it
Okay,
in.
I'm trying, yeah. Usually it takes time. Right. So the question is how to make grids cheaper. This is an essential question for policymakers because, consumers are the ones actually paying for the grids at the end. So if we want to be really blunt, there are two ways to think about that. One is how to build less, or rather, I would say how to build just the optimal amount of grid at the right location. And the second one, once we already know how much we need to build, is how to build it cheaper. And here, over the first block is how to reduce the overall costs of grid development. So to build less and to build it cheaper. And here I listed a few policy options we can think of. And this is not a comprehensive list, but I think it includes the major ways to reduce the overall cost of grids. So in the bracket of build less, of course, we need to plan much better. We know about the lots of discussion going on now on the trans-European network at the transmission level. We have to make sure that we actually invest every single euro to the place which brings the biggest net benefit for the consumers. So we need to integrate across the borders. We need to integrate between transmission and distribution. And this is a very, very difficult task because the grids are regulated entities and everyone who connects to the grids, they are market players in Europe. The second one is we have to make sure that whatever we have at the edge of the grid, they operate in accordance to grid availability. Flexibility for grid means that sometimes congestion at the local grid is not at the same time when the prices are high, where the supply and demand balance at the bidding zone. So we have to be aware that sometimes it coincides, but sometimes it doesn't. And of course, one of the first best solution to coordinate between the two, the grids and the prices, is locational marginal pricing. This is a pricing which we don't have in Europe. We have elsewhere in globally. And the whole idea behind it is that uh, uh, we have prices which actually reflect grid realities. Now we have prices assuming that there are grids everywhere available to transport all the energy we need to, which is not the case in reality. So the prices we are living now and that provide incentives for operational reasons, they are not real prices, but average prices. The second one is digitalization. Sometimes we call it smarting of the grids. And broadly, that means that we need to have real-time information what's going on in the grids to be able to use them as much as possible. In the past, grid operators were very, very conservative the way they use their grids because, of course, if something goes badly, then there is a huge political risk. But we cannot keep that traditional and very conservative assumptions. We have to have much more data and much more closer to real time than before. Connection management. There are lots of discussion on connection queues in Europe. The reason why we need to deal with the connection queues is now we don't really know what is the real demand for grids. The connection queues, they don't reflect the real demand because of multiple projects and ghost project in the queue. So we really have to make the management much more slick and efficient to actually understand how much project, how many project, and what kind of project actually want to connect to the grid. So that's more or less about the build less bracket. The second one is how to build cheaper. We all know that grids are capex heavy. They are really capital intensive sector. So one way is to reduce the financing cost, to reduce all kinds of risks the investors faces when dealing with the grids. So one is to reduce the regulatory, increase the regulatory predictability. So of course, the regulation should balance between being stable enough to lower the risk for investors, but on the other hand, it needs to be flexible enough. If circumstances change, a very fixed regulation which is bad, it actually is bad for the whole system. So that's a very important task for the national regulators. The second one is that we have to anticipate future demand for grids. But again, this is a balancing act because we cannot build a grid wherever someone says that he will need the grid, because we can then have grids which are not utilized or not utilized as much as we would like. And of course, the consumer has to pay for those grid elements as well. So we need to have anticipation, but based on a very robust future understanding of how quickly electrification will go at what voltage levels. Again, this is not an easy task. The next one is not so much a European concept, but I think it has implications for Europe as well. In Europe, it's TSOs and the DSOs has a monopoly of building the new grid elements. This monopoly has been eased in some of the member states. Definitely, it's not a monopoly in outside Europe. The reasons to open up building of new grids to third parties is, first of all, sometimes they are quicker to build it. Sometimes they are cheaper because you can actually act a competition for builders. So this is a way to explore in Europe a new policy avenue. And the last one is permitting. If the permitting is very complicated, the deadlines, no one actually considers the deadlines or keeps the deadlines, that's an actual risk for the investors and makes the whole grid exercise much more expensive. So that's all about the reduction. Then the second step is, okay, this is the amount of grid cost we have, then there is a way or there is a decision for policymakers how to allocate these costs. And here there are 4 ways to allocate it, or 4 questions for policymakers between member states, and this is applicable for cross-border capacities. So that's a very specific animal. Within the countries, between grid users group, households versus industry, for example. Over time, current users versus future users. So intertemporal allocation, that's also a question. And the last one is between bill payers and taxpayers. So whether all the cost is actually paid by the consumers, electricity consumers in their bill, or some of the cost is shifted to the general budget. And the last one is, the last step was, okay, how you design the network tariff. And this is very much intertwined with between the grid users over time. So these last two blocks are not completely independent of each other. And this is a major issue, a major question for the national regulators. Why? Because the way the network tariff is designed has an implication how the grid users use the grid, and then has a loop flow back to the how much the grid will cost. So this is not a one-way flow, this is a circular thing. So that's why the network design is a very, very important question in each of the member states. And I think I'll stop here.
Well, thanks a lot,
So,
Juja, for this very comprehensive introduction. I think it's a great segue into our speakers today. But before we move to our speakers, I would like to let you know that the session today is being recorded. I should also let you know that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the page, and we will get back to them after the two presentations, unless I see that there's an immediate need for clarification, of course. So don't hesitate to put your question. If you have a question which is, directed at one speaker in particular, you can also put it here. For example, like, could you tell me where you got this number from, or whatever? You can also put in here, and maybe they can also respond bilaterally on the Q&A chat function. So let's start with our two speakers today. Welcome and thanks a lot for joining us. We are very honored to have such a great panel today. Um, so we have Albert Banal Estagnol and Nihal Smolen. And thanks a lot for joining us. So I'll start by asking you to introduce yourself before we move into the presentation. So Albert, we'll start with you. So you are a professor of economics and finance at Universitat Pompeu Fabra and at the Barcelona School of Economics. Could you tell us a bit about your research and how grids became part of your work?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me in this webinar. So my research goes along a long time. So I've been working on the energy markets for quite some time, and in parallel, in general regulation and the competition issues. And then on the other side, also I've been working in the financial sector. So essentially, kind of the networks and the investments that we need to do in the networks became kind of an area where I joined these two areas of research that I've done always in my life.
Thanks a lot, and we'll come back to you in a minute for your presentation. Now I'm turning to Michal. So you are the head of the energy team at the Polish Economic Institute. So could you tell us a bit more about the institute and what you do there?
Polish Economic Institute is a public research institution that supports the government with dedicated research, but also publishes openly to general public. And we look at the topic we are discussing today, both from the point of view of energy policy, but also from the point of view of industrial policy. And as we know, those two perspectives might clash to an extent. So that's a very interesting topic, and we'll probably go back to that later today.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I think there's a lot of potential trade-offs we can discuss today. So I'm very excited to the discussion. So a reminder for people in the audience to put their questions into the Q&A, as we will now move to the presentation. So Albert will ask you to give us some context on grid costs. So why are they going up? What's the link with the energy transition? What are the implications for consumers and policymakers? So Albert, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Let me just try to make it full screen.
Yes, that's okay.
Okay. These just are a few slides, kind of also reintroducing the topics, and I'm actually going to build on the introduction that was just made, right? So I would want in this presentation to talk about how grid investments translate into bills, and the trade-offs that we face, especially policymakers as well as regulators in terms of deciding on how to allocate those costs. Okay, I wanted to also start with a premise that of course I'm going to try to think about or to discuss about ideas of how to make this investment cheaper or better. But of course, it goes without saying that this investment needs to be done, right? So it's not optional. We really need to do those investments to maintain reliability and as well as meeting the climate objectives. Okay, so clearly we expect demand for electricity to increase massively in the coming years with the electrification of transport and heating. So on the demand side, we see a heavy need for investment. On the supply side, we also see a transformation of the model, right? So we have all the introduction of decentralized and renewable generation, and we have also this digitalization also of the network. Okay, so all this added complexity, of course, generates constraints and connection challenges that we're already experiencing, right? So there is this need to transform the current system in something which is completely new. That's something that was not designed for the purpose we want to use it for in the coming years and decades, right? So here I have just one graph showing the expectation of the increase in demand for electricity. We see also the underlying the electricity demand going up, but also the new uses or the new needs for electricity with electric vehicle charging, green hydrogen production, and also even carbon capture. And of course, it's not only about the scale of the cost that we're going to be facing, but it's also the structure, right? So in the past, we were always thinking of the energy system, electricity, and even transport as something that was much more based on variable costs, right? So based on fuels and less on an upfront investment. And now we're moving to a system where the marginal costs are relatively low, and what is big is the upfront investment, right? So both in terms of the way in which we produce the electricity, the renewable energy plants, as well as the networks, right? So we're going from a system of variable cost to something a lot more based on fixed cost. Okay, and here is where the capital and financing and the regulation become a lot more central, as well as the redistribution. No, how we distribute those costs among the different users and consumers, right? And something I was also mentioned before. It's not only this fact that is based a lot more on this upfront cost means that we also need to think about the time horizon, right? So because it clearly the assets we build are going to be used for quite some years, and then here we have intertemporal trade-offs, right? So we might need to do the investment today, but then we might reap the benefits into the future. So we might see higher costs today, but then with doing all these investments, that of course is going to lower our not only it's going to help us in terms of climate objectives, but it's also going to be reducing our long-term costs, as well as the exposure also to these geopolitical shocks we're seeing nowadays. So clearly here we have also an intertemporal dimension, right? And of course, all these costs are affecting consumer bills. No, as is mentioned, right? So networks, the systems are in Europe regulated monopolies. Consumers need to pay for the investment, the financing, and the operation, and we need to see how we split those costs among the users today, as well as the users from today and tomorrow, right? So it's not only important the scale of the investment, but also how do we allocate the cost recovery, right? So in how much time we allocate the recovery of the cost. And here another element that becomes super important is the cost of capital, right? So financing becomes almost as important as the size of the investments themselves, right? Now, thinking about ways to reduce costs, one of the things is that we need to do smart investments, and here I wanted to emphasize also the coordination needs, right? So traditionally, networks have been regulated separately, even transmission and distribution, without thinking too much about the potential users of that of those networks. And this has led to congestion and to problems, connection problems, right? So the question here is how can we coordinate the need for investment with the location of the investments, of the generation investments, right? So this is one of the clearly important thing for both for the new renewable energy plans, as well as even for electric vehicles and all the other potential users of the networks, right? Something else that also been mentioned before, right? So we need to make sure, in order to reduce the size of the investments, we need to make use of flexibility, right? So to avoid to have the need of a big network at all times, to have a need of a network or at the peak levels, right? So and the question is, how can we get this flexibility, either from the the demand side through demand response, or from the supply side, right? So through storage, or even through smart charging, right? So the flexibility is going to be a super important element to invest in the coming years, right? And then the third thing I would mention is not only about the size of the investment and that we need to do, but also the regulatory and financial part, because this is clearly that's going to be one of the most important parts on our electricity bills. It was mentioned at the beginning that it's currently 1/3, right? So currently we pay on average 1/3 of the energy bills on the network. What's going to happen? The prediction is this is going to increase much further in coming years because of this, because of the size of these investments that we need to do. But then, of course, the reduction of the fuel costs, right, and the need. And the need for additional energy costs, right? So this creates a series of trade-offs, right? That are important, right? So one is speed versus affordability. Of course, if you want to build quicker, then that might not be the cheapest. we might want to give a lot of incentives, but then of course that might be too expensive. We have these trade-offs between present and future consumers, and we have this issue I mentioned before on the expansion versus the flexibility. So just to mention that, of course, a few trade-offs. There is no cost-free solution, and clearly these are trade-offs that policymakers will have. And just 2 seconds on the conclusion of my set of slides, just saying that, of course, the grid investments are necessary. So this is going to be a greater part of our energy bill. That's for sure. But we need to be smart on how we, on how we make these investments to reduce or to minimize the increase that we'll need to face. And here, important things is going to be efficient planning, flexibility, and how we finance those investments. So for me, it's not whether to invest or not the question, but it's how we do it at the cheapest possible way, at cheapest possible cost.
Thanks a lot, Albert. That was very interesting. I myself have a lot of questions, but I will keep them for after the 2 presentations. And I encourage our audience to put their questions into the Q&A box, and you will find this at the bottom of your page. So please go ahead. I will gather them, I will group them. So don't hesitate to just pop your questions there as they are coming, and we will address them after Michal's presentations. So now, Michal, we've asked you to give us some context about Poland's electricity grid. What's happening there, and what does it mean for consumers and policymakers? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would discuss Polish situation, taking into account both my current experience at Polish Economic Institute, but also my previous engagement in NGO think tank Instrat. And my main message is that we should avoid shortcuts in network tariffs. And this is very much, I would say, it resonates with the topic of trade-offs. Like there are, of course, there is a lot of political discussion around network tariffs, and there is a widespread frustration with high electricity cost in Europe. But my main thesis is that it's just there is no cheap electricity in an inefficient power system, and grids will be an enormous part of the cost going forward. At the earlier stages, there was a possibility to add some wind and solar to the existing grids that still worked under the previous paradigm, but going forward, when the saturation of the renewables increases, the active investment is very much necessary and very much something that we have to consider in our planning. So my first thought is that we have to look at total system costs to recognize the full advantages of developing new generation consistent with investments in the grid. And this is something that is often lacking in both national plan, in government plans. Actually, that was usually a weaker part of modeling for Polish energy strategy. And quite often it was made that the generation mix was optimized, and then in the second stage, the grids were added to just fit the plan. And this is unfortunately not a good way forward. And we checked that with our Instrat modeling report that included also the grid expansion costs. And when we optimized both grid expansion cost, investment costs, and all other operating costs that are in the system, we've seen that the investment costs by 2040 can fall by 23% if we look at those costs together, instead of adding the grid in the second stage. And this results in other effects because we have smaller grid, a bit more curtailment of renewables, but this is worth it because of those savings from investment, and also, for example, additional energy storage that is also used not to mitigate just the renewable curtailment that is a result of balancing issues on the system level, but also that mitigates the effects of the local grid-related curtailment that appears in that kind of modeling. And this strong vision, this strong plan is important also because developing the grid is just a very long-term game, and we're already capital costs were mentioned, but I would also like to mention the supply chains for network equipment. Unfortunately, we see that in Europe and around the world, there are shortages in development of various parts of the network equipment, and very much that affects the costs of the investments. So if we have a vision that the grids will be expanded, to what degree, what kind of investments will be done, then we also can have these investments in supply chains that lower the costs. And when we think about well-designed network tariffs, we should just focus on what encourages the market actors to lessen the strain on the grid, to work with the physical realities. And here I have a couple of points. So first of all, you have to oversee TSOs and DSOs to create incentives for them and also to prevent excessive cost shifting. And this is something that can be very challenging politically, also even like on the analytical level, because TSOs and DSOs have this unique knowledge about the functioning of the grid on various levels. It's very hard to challenge their knowledge and their understanding, and of course they are also stakeholders with interest. So we have to be sure that they work in the most efficient way, that they have incentives and that there is oversight. Also, because we have to build trust in the process. And this is unfortunately something that we currently lack to a degree in Poland. There is a discussion about DSO and the level of network tariffs, and there are concerns that they earn too much money. So there have to be trust that they are well overseen. And we also, when we think about the tariffs, we have to also look wider. And this is why I mentioned problematic fees and subsidies. In Poland, we have, for example, these capacity fees that finance capacity market. And I have made a small exercise by taking two different kind of industrial consumers, the baseload consumer and also variable consumer, like a smaller factory, for example, and checked what happens if they avoid using energy in the peak, and also if they, for example, use more electricity around midday when the costs are very low, both on the wholesale market and now also in network tariffs, because for those consumers, there are those multi-level network tariffs that reward using electricity off peak. And unfortunately, there are very slight, when you look at the capacity fee, there is very little advantage of lowering consumption during the peak, and there are heavy penalties for increasing it during the midday. So for this factory, they have to pay around 50 euro per megawatt hour. So you have to really earn like the advantage from the wholesale market, and network tariffs has to be very big to balance that. And for the baseload consumer, they paid 11 euro per megawatt hour by increasing this consumption during midday hours. But this all affects all their consumption during the day, because the formula for capacity payment very much promotes baseload profile and demand profile, and they change that in that. And the cause for caution about network tariffs, two cases: household consumers. We of course want to avoid energy poverty and we want to encourage electrification. However, those fees are necessary to guide investment and to encourage more efficient consumption profile. So my recommendation would be to promote time of use network tariffs that encourage more efficient action in the system, to address flat fees and taxes that increase the bills without improving, for example, demand profile, and also just to have the specialized measures to and target energy poverty with financial support, deal with social problems with the dedicated social measures. And because the other area where there is a temptation to use network tariffs to achieve things that have little directly in common with functioning of the power system are those energy intensive industries. And for them, of course, network costs are one of the important positions in the cost of electricity. And in some states, I have done recently a review, and it's quite clear that dedicated network tariffs serve as kind of hidden industrial subsidies that rise costs for other consumers. And of course, there are advantages from having those large, very predictable consumers in the grid, but instead of just lowering their fees directly, we should instead reward actual contribution to the grid. For example, if they are very well balanced, we have to have efficient balancing price formation to have that being an advantage that they can earn money. Also make them contribute to demand response, to local flexibility markets, actual use the specific ways in which they improve the grid, and also avoid promoting baseload consumption, which was good before, but it's not very well, and just don't use network fees to go around state aid regulation. And just my two last sentences is that everything becomes more complex. Now in Poland, but also in Germany, there is discussion and legislative action to shift some of the costs of the grid constraints from the grid operators to, for example, renewable energy developers. And we have to consider the whole picture, that some costs are just shifted and not often solved. So we have to look at the whole picture, and also we have to look on multiple areas. Like for example, we have levels. We have, for example, local flexibility markets that address very specific grid challenges on the local level, and they are great, and they are also now being developed in Poland. But part of the reason why there are those local grid constraints is because of the nationwide wrong economic incentives that increase the strain on the grid. So we have to look beyond the different stakeholders at the whole picture and total system costs, and lower that to actually achieve cheaper electricity and cheaper grid. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Super interesting. Also, very good to see what the actual trade-offs discussions are right now in Poland between these different stakeholders. Thanks a lot for sharing this insight. So we are now going to move into the Q&A. So I already have a couple of questions written. If you have more, please put them into the box and we'll try to take it as we move forward. Before we do that, I would like to invite participants to register to our webinar. So we hold this webinar on a regular basis, and there is a registration list, so you can join us. My colleague is going to put the link into the chat. Please get in touch with us also if you have ideas about some topics you think we should discuss, or speakers you would like to see on scene. We're very happy to take suggestions for the webinar series. So now, I know my colleague Zsuzsa has a question for the two speakers. So I'm going to pass the mic to Zsuzsa. And in the meantime, I'll be taking the questions from the audience.
Thanks very much, Marianne. I have a question which is very much a follow-up to both of your presentation, and that's, we all assume that within the electricity bill, the network element will increase in the future. My question would be, do you have any kind of estimates for your country, like the trajectory of the network tariff in the future? And if so, who has prepared such a forecast, and is it at all discussed publicly?
Yeah, I can start. So about Poland, I think this is very interesting case because this is also an example of the social and political process that accompanies decision on the grid expansion and then the cost allocation. So 5 years ago, there was an initiative called Charter for Effective Transformation of the distribution network. That was cooperation between DSOs, TSO, and energy regulator, and they jointly developed a kind of investment plan for the grids with envisioned investment till 2030 around 30 billion euro. So quite a lot, and actually it was much more progressive than our national energy strategy at the time. They just recognize that these renewables are coming and that they have to prepare. And then we have seen that this charter was also a basis for the network tariffs that are now being set. So they are set on the level that should be aligned with those investment plans, but we see that they are also becoming controversial. And I would say there are two reasons for that. One reason is that there are still controversies about high level direction of the transition of the Polish energy system. So some stakeholders that criticize network costs actually also criticize the whole direction that we should go to this renewable based power system that requires those investments. Yeah, so that's one topic. The second topic is that the charter was very much conducted mostly by stakeholders from the operator side. Now there is also an increased cooperation with external actors, but this is very much what I said about trust. Because of the natural monopolies and very regulated nature of our topic, this trust between different stakeholders in the system is very important. And in Poland, we are just building that. I can say that industrial stakeholders are usually not happy and they think that they are actually paying excess cost of the changes, and they are being somehow taken advantage of.
I would say for the case of Spain, there's been a lot of discussion about the investment in the system. In Spain has invested a lot of has made a lot of investments in renewable energy production, and of course the network has as a result has been super affected. So there is now a lot of congestion and a lot of connection problems. So there needs to be a massive investment in the coming years. So there's been already a discussion on the size of the investments that need to be done in the next 5 years. Then the next step, of course, is to translate those investments into the tariffs, right? But the first step, of course, is between the networks and the ministry to decide on the investments before thinking about the effect on the tariffs, right? But here is still a bit. I mean, so I think we have moved a bit further than the old traditional system about thinking about network expansion. But I think we still are a bit on that framework, right? Because that's what we've been used to in the years till now, right? So it's difficult to move away. But again, I mean, just to say that at least in Spain there are massive investments pending in the networks.
Thanks a lot. Maybe a quick follow-up question. So, I mean, you mentioned the importance of building trust and involving, different groups into the discussion. I'm just wondering because these discussions, they're very technical. And once, someone starts to look into the scenarios and, how quick electrification will be, what's the different mix of solutions that, people will be investing in, it quickly becomes very technical. I'm just wondering, are you seeing in your countries like increased involvement from civil society in order to get involved with this discussion? Because we know from other geographies that this is the challenge, right? To have everyone on the same level of understanding before you're able to discuss the trade-offs.
I would say that there is still a gap because the topic is extremely technical and it's very hard for the civil society to meaningfully participate. We see more contributions from the industry, but also it's very much that everybody presents their own perspective, yes, and the perspective, short-term perspective of the consumers is not necessarily aligned with the long-term perspective of the whole power grid. So I think this is something that still is very much lacking. I would also mention quickly the discussions that we have in Poland about the scale of infrastructure needed that is related to the discussion about future electricity demand, because there is of course this vision that electricity demand will rise because we will have electrification and we want to electrify the industry, and on the other hand we have those opinions that actually Polish demographic trends are very negative, that our economic growth will slow down somehow, that heavy industry will just go to other places around the world instead of electrifying in Poland, when it is expensive. So this is also when you have environmental groups that are actually skeptical about this very large scale investment because they don't see this whole demand happening. So there is also a kind of green growth versus degrowth aspect in it.
Just commenting again on the process, on how how we take into account the views of the different stakeholders. Just always, I mean, to me, I always make this comparison, right? So because Spain is where I'm from and where I work now, and before I was working in the UK, and I had been working with Ofgem, the regulator in the UK, and I was always a big admirer on essentially on the process they were following, something that has been there for decades, right? So of essentially any decision about any regulatory decision, including the tariffs for the following years, it has always been a process, a very much a process where a lot of people have been involved, right? So from publication of a preliminary decision, then people could comment on stakeholders could comment on this, and then the regulator would respond to that. So it's been a process that have been involving stakeholders for decades, right? In Spain, we have been going really up and down on the procedural issues, right? So we had even a period where it was not even the regulator that was taking the decision, or an independent body, but what it was the government itself, right? So even raising complaints from the European Commission, right? So going from one extreme to the other, right? So I think. And of course, getting out of this and going into a system where so it's open and it's open to everybody to comment and to take into account the views of everyone is something that is not, it cannot be done overnight, right? So it takes some time to build this, I would say, tradition, or this procedural this process. But again, I mean, I think it's super important going forward.
Thanks a lot. Shuja, I know you wanted to follow up
Yeah.
on with one question, and I saw some questions in the Q&A box that also relate to what you wanted to ask. So can you try to group them?
Okay, so I would like to, you mentioned, Alberto, non-wire solutions as one of the key policy options, which is still a bit untapped by regulators. So my question to both of you would be, to what extent incentives to DSOs and TSOs are there to employ non-wire solutions as opposed to traditional copper and wire solutions? Also, DERs at the edge of the grid, like distributed storage and distributed PV. So our DSOs and TSOs in Poland and Spain have incentives or incentivize to look for alternatives, which are sometimes cheaper and much quicker to implement.
I think they do have some incentives because I see that it is happening. Yeah. So, but it's very challenging to actually assess to what degree this is an economic incentive and to what degree it is also a kind of public interest motivation by people that work in the TSO and DSOs, because they are like a very specific kind of business. Yeah? They are also a kind of public institution. So it's quite challenging to assess externally. But I would mention that what is interesting is that we see that with new project, it is more of a problem of the developer. Yeah, increasingly the problem of developers. So we are talking about cable pooling, about access agreements, connection agreements that don't guarantee that your electricity will be taken off. So that's a kind of savings on the grid, a cost for the developer. And on the other hand, we see instruments that address existing installation and existing infrastructure. So, for example, those local flexibility markets where DSO procures a kind of, for example, additional demand response on very local level to address a kind of congestion that exists. And this is something that we are moving to. So the activity is there, although this is extremely complex institutionally, also because we have part of the systems are from 5 years ago or before, and part of them are planned for the future. So you have this, I would say, a composite of different eras in thinking about the grid and the system that have to coexist. So very much a challenging also thing to assess from the outside.
Yeah, I would say in Spain, some incentives in that direction exist, but they're still at the very, I think at the very early stage, right? So both in terms of the local flexibility, right, and all this, I would say non-wire solutions. I think in Spain, it's kind of the big issue, right? So because we have built all this massive renewable energy production, right? So that it's we know it has this on and off, right? So now the next step should be clearly investing in all what is flexibility, right? So storage, batteries, all this, and also on the demand side. So both on the supply and the demand side, because we have to do it if we have done these massive investments in renewable energy, right? So we've done these investments that have been catching up with what Germany did, but now we need to also catch up, or we need to go in the direction that I think Germany took in terms of the flexibility. I think that's really the next challenge, right? And I would really want, and I think that we really need to invest a lot more on this. I mean, not only, but we need to spend also quite a bit on that, and maybe not all the amount we are thinking of in terms of the network itself, right?
Thanks a lot. It's super interesting. And I mean, we're already approaching the end of our time together. There's one more question that I'd like to ask you. How do we handle uncertainty in the cost benefit analysis because we know about the costs, but we're not quite sure about the future benefits, especially as we're not quite sure what the system would look like, what the load will be like, etc. So there's less certainty about this than what we have about, what the works would be of doing it tomorrow. And I would attach that to a broader question that I have. So what do you think would be useful right now for energy companies, for regulators to do their job? So, what kind of signals would be important, you think, from governments in order to help them actually make decisions that are beneficial for the society we want to build for tomorrow? So, both a narrow and a broad question.
I mean, let me start with a broad question, right? So I think the most important signal, I think at the moment is not to hesitate, right? So not to not to give the impression that we are going backwards in terms of the energy transition. If we give mixed signals about this, which is somehow the perception I'm having. So if we don't do this, then I think we're in the right track, right? Clearly, I think a system where we need to think about investments and essentially trying things, right? So because we know that waiting in some of these investments is going to be worse, right? So we really need to try things and we need to reward people that try things, that take risks, even if ex post these might not have been a good investments or might not have been efficient. But we need to keep trying. We need to keep trying things. But I think we need to think about all these risk rewards. We need to identify which projects are worth doing, are worth taking those risks and make such investments, because we need now all technology, we need all solutions. We need to investigate all of this to see what is best.
Yeah, I can add very shortly that also be more active on implementing policies that concern the demand. So there is a lot of talk about electrification, and there are electrification goals on the European level, on the national levels, but there is still, I would say, some level of concern, like when would we see this increase in electricity demand? And I think this is partially because the policies in buildings and heating and also transport, they are quite, in many European countries, they are unfortunately behind the level that the state we should be, and behind the technological maturity that those technologies often have.
Thanks, Zsuzsa. Do you want to add something? I know your CBA is your favorite topic.
Well, it's not my favorite topic. I mean, uncertainty is like we have to live with it. We all wish for a perfect foresight, at least as far as grid development concerned, but we will never get that. So this kind of how much we can anticipate the future is a really key question. With regard to grids, you have to compare the cost of having less grids or cost of having too much grids. And my assumption and other people's assumption is that probably we should be biased and more in favor of overbuilding or the risk of overbuilding. This is like a general wisdom. Some people, they do modeling on that. What to do with that uncertainty? And I think there are probably two ways I can imagine, but these are just like rough ideas. One is probably to come up with so-called like a least regret method, like to prioritize projects which are robust across all kinds of uncertain scenarios because there are uncertainties. So maybe we should move the CBA analysis to that direction, like a least regret analysis. And the other one is, and Michal mentioned that the DSOs and TSOs, they always know much better than the regulator. So the question is how actually to incentivize them to make the best choices, the best priority list for grids. And the only way to incentivize them is through money. So I think it should be somehow incorporated in their revenue system or revenue regime, basically. But these are wide ideas, never been implemented anywhere. So
Thanks, Zsuzsa. Well, we need another hour, right, to discuss this last statement of yours. So, I mean, I learned a lot for sure. Zsuzsa, what would you take home? What kind of messages did you learn from the discussion today?
Well, I think we probably can agree that we need to build grids. I don't think anyone questions that. But it's very important to state it out loud. But I think we have to move away from that. And the question is where, how much, and what is the priority? Priority is important not only because I don't know, limited amount of money available, but we don't have enough transformers. We don't have enough human resources to actually build the grid. So priority needs to be a real question for policymakers and for the national regulators. And of course, this is a big coordination game. And in Europe, because those using the grids and those actually managing the grids are different entities, and the lead time is so different. To build a storage, you can do it in a few months. To build a grid, you need 5 years. So this is a coordination game. And I guess we need to use all the market coordination ways like pricing and incentives, and also the administrative one on planning. So we can't just simply say that one or the other. We need both. And this is not an easy game. And for planning, we discussed a bit the planning of grids vis-a-vis future grid users. And here I think the procedure probably is very different if you talk about large loads like electrolyzers at data centers. Probably planning procedures are different than, for example, to anticipate how many EVs will be in a certain city district. So across voltage level, we discussed that. This is very imminent problem. The governance, TSOs and DSOs are different entities, but they are running basically the same grid, interconnected grid. And also something which we haven't mentioned is across fuels. So we are developing a new energy system. So at transmission level, we have to make sure that the way we develop the hydrogen network is somehow integrated the way we think about the transmission grid, the power grid, and at the distribution level also, but probably there the crucial point is how we plan the power grid and how we think about the future of the gas distribution grid. So more questions than answers, sorry.
Thanks, Zsuzsa. So there's definitely enough to plan for a next episode of this webinar. So thanks a lot. A warm thanks to our speakers. This was great. So I certainly learned a lot. So I hope to see you very soon for another series of the Electrification Academy. So you can register on our mailing list. So I think my colleague put the link into the chat box. And you can reach out to us anytime if you have more suggestions for this academy. Thanks a lot. Have a nice day.